Did you know that over 380,000 African American soldiers served in the United States Army in World War I? We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about African American history with Dr. Chad Williams on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll explore African American involvement in World War I with historian Dr. Chad Williams. But first, a trivia question. Who was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard University? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Chad Williams on the show today. Dr. Williams is the Samuel J. and Augusta Spector Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University. Chad earned a BA with honors in History and African American Studies from UCLA and received both his MA and PhD in History from Princeton University. He specializes in African American and modern United States history, African American military history, the World War I era, and African American intellectual history. His first book, Torchbearers of Democracy, African American Soldiers in the World War I Era, was published in 2010 by the University of North Carolina Press. It is widely praised as a landmark study and has won numerous awards. Dr. Williams has earned fellowships from the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and the Ford Foundation. His new book, The Wounded World, W.E.B. Du Bois and the First World War, was published this year. Welcome to the show, Chad. It's great to have you here.
All right, thanks for having me on.
What's the most unique thing about you?
I would say one of the most unique things about me is maybe my intellectual curiosity. I think I've always been a very curious person, asking a lot of questions, quiet at times, but also just very probing in terms of the questions I asked, the things that I explore, areas that I like to write about and teach about. And ultimately, I think that's what attracted me to someone like W.B. Du Bois, who is one of the most intellectually curious people I think this country has ever produced.
One reviewer called your book Torchbearers of Democracy, African American Soldiers in the World War I Era, part military history, part social history, and part commentary. What piqued your interest in this subject?
When I went to graduate school, I initially thought that I was going to study the Reconstruction era. I was interested in the effects of war. I was interested in thinking about the ways in which war shaped African American notions of freedom, citizenship, and democracy. And as I began to read more about the World War I era, I became more fascinated with that period and realized that there were still so many unanswered questions related to the Black experience in World War I and the experiences of African American soldiers and veterans in particular. So I dove right in and wrote my dissertation, which became my first book. And that really kind of sparked my interest in looking at someone like W.B. Du Bois and his relationship to World War I.
You've stated that the First World War was a turning point in the struggle for African American freedom, citizenship, and self-determination. Tell us more about that.
Certainly, when we think about struggles for African American freedom, citizenship, democracy, oftentimes World War I gets overlooked. We certainly point to the Civil War and its aftermath. We often look to World War II and the emergence of what we now considered to be the modern civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. But it's really important to take a step back and to think about the ways in which World War I were very generative for how African Americans thought of themselves in terms of their citizenship, how it expanded their notions of democracy, and how they used the war as a moment to fight for their rights as citizens, but also as human beings on a national as well as on a global scale.
You've stated that democracy in American history has been a work in progress, deeply flawed, inconsistent, and contradictory. Why do you say that?
Well, the very idea of democracy certainly has deep roots, and America is a country ostensibly founded on very powerful ideals of democracy and freedom. The harsh reality is that those ideals have been absent from the histories, from the lives, even in a contemporary context of many Americans, many American citizens. That's particularly the case for the experiences of peoples of African descent. African Americans are in many ways the litmus test about the viability of American democracy. And throughout this country's history, the exclusion of African Americans from fully participating in American democracy has exposed certainly the flaws and failures of democracy, but also highlighted its potentials and the fact that in the case of Black people, it has always been something worth fighting for. That was certainly something that W.B. Du Bois deeply believed in throughout his entire life.
This was so interesting. You said while conducting your research at University of Massachusetts for your first book, you found a collection curiously titled Du Bois World War I Materials. You've stated that you had no idea what it was and didn't expect much, but you uncovered an 800-page unfinished manuscript on the Black experience in World War I. Du Bois worked on this for more than 2 decades, but it remained unfinished. Tell us more about that.
So it was really one of those amazing graduate school moments that everyone dreams of. I was doing research for my dissertation, which ultimately became my first book, Torchbearers of Democracy, and quite literally stumbled upon this remarkable archive. I was given 6 microfilm reels by the university librarian, and after going through them, realized that I was looking at an unfinished and ultimately unpublished manuscript by W.E.B. Du Bois on the Black experience in World War I, a book that he very dramatically titled The Black Man and the Wounded World. And to my great astonishment, no other historian had talked about this remarkable project that Du Bois devoted over 2 decades of his life to thinking about, to writing about, and ultimately never finished it. And really from that moment, I was determined to learn more about this project, to learn more about why Du Bois devoted so much time to ultimately to writing this book, which ultimately was never completed, but more broadly, what it tells us, what it could potentially tell us about Du Bois himself, what it could tell us about the relationship between African Americans and World War I, and more broadly, the struggles for freedom, citizenship, and democracy for Black people in the 20th century.
I can imagine the excitement you must have felt like finding a chest of treasure in the library.
It was certainly a mind-boggling moment. I had so many questions and spent a lot of time trying to answer as many of them as I could, which ultimately was reflected in my book, The Wounded World.
And at what point did you decide, oh, this is going to be a book for me?
Pretty soon after I delved into those materials, I knew that there was another project here. Obviously, I had to finish my dissertation. My advisor was very adamant about that. But I think if I hadn't done my first book, Torchbearers of Democracy, I wouldn't have had the necessary background and, quite frankly, the necessary confidence to tackle a subject as big as W.E.B. Du Bois and an unfinished and unpublished manuscript by W.E.B. Du Bois. So I knew that this was going to be the second book, but it certainly, took, it was a process to get there and to ultimately complete it.
As you said, your second book is called The Wounded World. You discussed Du Bois's campaign to persuade Black people to fight in World War I. Why did he do that?
Du Bois considered himself a pacifist. He was against war in theory, but he also believed that war had the potential to expand the boundaries, the opportunities for African Americans in terms of their citizenship and demand and expand the very idea of democracy itself. So when the United States entered the war, he really put his credibility on the line, set aside his pacifist principles to encourage African Americans to support their country. In this sense, it harkens back to Du Bois's famous articulation of double consciousness in his classic book, The Souls of Black Folk, which he published in 1903, where he talks about the tension between being Black on the one hand and American on the other. These two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And Du Bois felt that by supporting the war, by fighting in the war as soldiers, by sacrificing as loyal, patriotic citizens, Black people would be recognized as full 100% Americans.
And you discuss the talented 10th in your book. Who were the talented 10th and what were their responsibilities according to Du Bois?
The talented 10th, as Du Bois conceptualized them, were a group of African Americans who were educated, who would ultimately lead the race into the future, who would stand at the forefront of uplifting the race, the bottom 90%, if you will. And he believed that this talented 10th was endowed with a particular responsibility to fight on the behalf of the race and its future. In the context of the war, he particularly saw African American officers as representing the talented 10th in the context of the United States military. And it was going to be these men who were part of the talented 10th who were going to demonstrate the ability of Black people to lead and to ultimately serve as examples of why African Americans deserved their full rights and citizenship.
Tell us a little bit about ultimately what you discovered as a result of writing your second book.
In writing my second book, The Wounded World, I discovered how complex Du Bois was, particularly as it related to the history of the war. Du Bois believed that the war was going to be a turning point in the history of Black people and other peoples of African descent in their quest for citizenship and democracy. And ultimately, he was wrong. Du Bois spent 20 years trying to write his book to make sense of the war on a historical level, but also on a deeply personal level. And I learned in the writing of my book how tortured the history and the legacy of the war was for Du Bois, and ultimately how important it was for his political evolution and his intellectual evolution as well.
And I'm curious to know if you have a favorite movie that takes place during World War I.
I think that there really hasn't been too many good movies about World War I, quite frankly, that have impressed me. And I think in part because most films on World War I completely overlook the Black experience in the war. There's films like, All Quiet on the Western Front and other kind of very heroic, dramatic films, which really focus on the European experience. But I think there is certainly a movie to be made about what the war meant for African Americans and other peoples of African descent. Perhaps a film starring W.B. Du Bois, based on my book. Who knows?
What's up next for you? What projects are you currently working on?
Well, I'm interested in trying to edit and bring Du Bois's manuscript to the public. It's really a remarkable document, which I think deserves publication as an example of Du Bois's deep commitments to writing about the war, but also his process of thinking and writing as a historian. So that's a project that hopefully will materialize. I'm also interested in thinking about Black studies and historical genealogies of Black studies, its development in various contexts in the 1930s and 1940s, but also thinking about Black studies more contemporarily, considering many of the very contentious debates that we're having about Black studies today.
And is there anything else you'd like to tell us about you or your work?
Well, I certainly encourage everyone to pick up a copy of The Wounded World. I think it's a great book. It's received some wonderful endorsements. And to encourage people to learn more about W.B. Du Bois. He's such an endlessly fascinating individual. There's so much to learn from his work, his insights, especially as it relates to our ongoing struggles to make sense of the wounded world that we continue to live in today.
Of course, we're going to encourage our listeners to have a look at your book. Are there other books that you would recommend if people wanted to know more about Du Bois and they might not, have a background in history? Where's a good starting point for them?
Well, I would start with Du Bois's writings themselves, particularly his most famous book, The Souls of Black Folk, which I assign in my classes every year. I tell my undergraduate students that they can't graduate without reading The Souls of Black Folk. So it's really a canonical text in so many ways. There's been a number of excellent biographies written about Du Bois, starting with David Levering Lewis's 2-volume Pulitzer Prize winning biographies on Du Bois. So certainly a number of different works where people can learn more about Du Bois and his significance.
And where can listeners find out more about you?
Please visit my website, chadowilliams.com. I'm also on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, and certainly be on the lookout for different book events that I may be doing in your local area.
And I will put a link to your website in the show notes. It was great to have you on the show, Chad. Thank you so much for taking time to be a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
Thank you so much.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. Who was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard University? Writer, scholar, and activist W.E.B. Du Bois was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard University in 1895. We'll end the show with something punny. Why did the soldier bring a blanket into a battle zone? He needed cover. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.